where do you think companies can better secure themselves? Besides the sharing information, what can companies do? Because I've previously spoken to Howard Schmidt and other people,
Yes.
and they said companies fail to implement good cyber hygiene. And with that in mind, should there be regulation, for example, in like making people patch systems that are on the critical infrastructure and other things like that? Because essentially they're leaving themselves vulnerable to highly preventable attacks.
Right. So regulation, the difficulty with regulation specifically is that the cyber environment is, as you well know, is so dynamic and so rapidly changing that I don't know whether a regulatory structure can meet the needs of such a dynamic environment. And so what we have developed in the government is the NIST framework, which is an analytic framework that says these are the criteria and these are the issues that one should take a look at when building a cyber hygiene architecture within one's own organization. And we think that framework is a very good model. And then there's the development and dissemination of best practices. And then there's also, and we see this advancing considerably, there are regulatory agencies on the federal government and the state governments. There are state attorneys general that are identifying companies that don't practice good cyber hygiene, that are woefully deficient, and they're bringing actions. And so I think across the board, we're trying to drive conduct that will cause companies to do the basic blocking and tackling, the instructions to employees about changing passwords, not clicking on unknown links, to also employing the tools, the basic tools, whether those are through vendors or the development of one's own IT capabilities, to build cyber defenses.
Well, with that in mind, because what you're saying is that the market and the environment is forcing pain upon people, which frankly I approve. But at the same time, well, there was a statement
I'm
from,
not sure I do, by
Okay.
the way, in all regards. So sometimes I think the imposition of liability before the development of a clear standard of care can be inequitable. And that's a very case-specific inquiry, so I raise a general concern.
Well,
but in any event.
yeah, but with that in mind, because again, you know, let's just say when somebody creates damage upon another party,
Yes.
you know, that's what we're talking about regarding that, and there is a give and take, and you're saying that essentially that's what the market is trying to drive. At the same time, there was a quote from the DHS Chief Information Security Officer who
Who's
said,
terrific.
Yeah,
Jeff is terrific.
Yeah, and I have no disagreement with that, because he made a statement I'm interested in if there's any movement on, where he said that people who consistently fail phishing tests should potentially have their clearances revoked. Is there any drive to that, like in any way, or that, because that was a comment that was made a little bit off the cuff, but there is some validity. So for example, when I worked at NSA, if I took a piece of paper out and wrote my shopping list on it, that would be a violation. I could be sent to jail. Is there similar movement in the cyber world where we're incurring liability to bad user behavior, just like there would be in the physical world with bad user behavior?
So that's something that we are looking at. Jeff's comment, while off the cuff, was by no means reckless, but was actually thoughtful, because that's one of the things that we are looking at. And we run tests. We send deliberately links to employees to determine whether they bite imprudently, and if they do, we use it as an opportunity to educate. But at some point in time, we're going to get on a continuum where if someone doesn't necessarily educate him or herself, the needs in an organization are such that we might have to consider whether other action is appropriate. And that's something that we are looking at very carefully.
Because there have been recent studies that showed, for example, that 5% of users cause 90% of damage. Is DHS have any programs to start mitigating that, both in the government sector and in the private, trying to promote that to the general public as well?
So, within the Department of Homeland Security, absolutely, we are increasing the robustness of our education programs for our employees, the reminders, and all sorts of processes and tools. Yes, and some of them are very, very creative, and I think our Undersecretary for Management, Russ Dio, deserves a lot of credit, as does, of course, our IT team, to include our CISO. In the private sector, of course, there's a commercial need. There's a market need to improve cyber hygiene, and we serve an education role. We have advisors out in the private sector speaking about the need for cyber hygiene, but companies, and the sophisticated ones, are very, very advanced and have their own programs and protocols in place to drive employee behavior.
Okay, well, a pseudo-related question was, you were at DEF CON in Black Hat this year, I believe, and you mentioned having hackers share information and potentially come in to work at DHS.
Yes.
What's the actual gist of that in your own words, now that you had a chance to think about those things?
Oh, I thought about them then too. Let me share with you the root of that idea. When I was leading U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, some of the visa programs that we administered were trying to draw skilled talent from other countries, and that included entrepreneurial talent, the startup enterprises. But we weren't very educated in the needs of the entrepreneurial community and what the startup enterprise really looked at, so that we can identify legitimate startup enterprises and also identify those that were not, so that we could protect the integrity of the system, but also realize the system's intent and potential. And we could have purchased literature and the like, but the thought that I had was, why not bring into the agency, on a full-time basis, but temporary, some accomplished entrepreneurs that are properly vetted, that could actually guide us in the development of training materials and policies. And so we did. We brought in 6 private sector entrepreneurs who had done well enough that they could devote 6 months or more, it turned out to be more, to us full-time in the development of our programs and the education of our leadership. They did a phenomenal job. Drawing on that, I saw extraordinary talent at the Black Hat and DEF CON, and I saw talent that could identify vulnerabilities, and in fact that talent was sharing those vulnerabilities with companies so that those companies could patch the vulnerabilities and be stronger. And I thought that was a very interesting enterprise and a very ethical one with which I previously had not been familiar. And I said, you know what? We should have that talent.
Well,
and it serves 2 functions. One, we bring in the talent, and we bring in the ethical hacker. And 2, the greatest concern that I had going into those conferences and that I left with was the fact that there's a significant trust deficit between that community and us, between the private sector and the public. And I want to close that. I want to eliminate that trust deficit. And if we could bring in talented individuals from the private sector, and they see what we do and how we do it, and we learn from them, I think that's a wonderful start.